art, and current events.
Okay, hi, welcome to Intelligent Talk. The website is intelligenttalk.com. Today's program is focused on who was Jack the Ripper, or Jack the Ripper overall. A famous case, 1888, London, Whitechapel area of London, East London, where approximately 5 prostitutes we think were killed by the famous person known as Jack the Ripper. We're very pleased to have Mr. Phil O'Connor with us. He's with the Jack the Ripper Museum in London, where he gives tours of sites linked to the killer and talks about the case. And I was had the pleasure of going on one of these tours. Phil, thank you for coming on the program today.
It's my pleasure.
Could you please give the website just for the museum, just for people and how they might be able to contact you or contact the museum to get a tour with you?
Absolutely. It's www.jacktherippermuseum.com.
Okay, www.jacktherippermuseum.com. And you're Phil O'Connor. Okay,
Yep.
Great. So just in reviewing this case and understanding it, there's a lot of things that I learned from your tour, and I just want to take the basics. It's 1888. We think 5 people were killed by Jack the Ripper. Is that right?
Well, yes, it's interesting. In your introduction there, you said approximately 5 people. There are 5 women who we are pretty certain were definitely killed by Jack the Ripper, but there's the potential for a 6th and possibly a 7th, an 8th. We just don't know. That's what makes it part of the mystery has made it such a mystery, Jack the Ripper.
Yes, and when I was going on the tour with you and you showed me those photos, it's just, I mean, you hear about it, but seeing those photos that you had of the killing, it's just unbelievably brutal. I would think it's probably more brutal than the Manson killings in California. It's hard to get more brutal than what he did, even though this was supposedly the civilized, 19th century. In looking at the area, one of the things in catching Jack the Ripper is a distinction between the city of London and London itself. And could you just explain, please, that distinction and how that made it hard to capture, how it made the case more complicated?
I can, absolutely. So the City of London is a small area in the middle of London. It's the original London. So when the Romans invaded in AD 43, they built walls around this settlement, which they called Londinium. And that remains its own entity within London. So the City of London is very different to London. London has expanded all the way around it, but it has its own rules and regulations. It has its own police force. So the City of London police the City of London, and London is policed by the Metropolitan Police. And the two police forces back in 1888 really didn't get on very well. There was a lot of envy, a lot of rivalry. They just didn't work well together.
Okay, and presumably the killer knew that, because he would do things that sort of blur the jurisdictions to make it difficult as who was in charge, correct? Is that right?
Well, it definitely appears that way. On September the 30th, 1888, that's the night of the double event. So Jack the Ripper claimed 2 victims that night, one in Whitechapel in London and one in Mitre Square, which is in the City of London. And it seems very clear that he, having successfully murdered somebody in Elizabeth Stride in Whitechapel in the early hours of the morning, but not able to murder her the way he has, with his signature style of ripping through the neck and then ripping through the body. He then goes to the City of London, where he knows he can create more confusion, bring the 2 police forces into loggerheads, and help to aid his escape after murdering his second victim.
So Phil, was that his normal modus operandi, is to do the killing, as you said, the neck and then the body? Was that generally how he did it?
So, every victim of his, if we only count the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper, every victim dies by having their throat cut. Only 4 of them then have their bodies ripped open. Elizabeth Stride, who I just mentioned, she dies just from having her throat cut.
Okay. All right. And one of the things I wanted to discuss, too, is discuss these poor women and just the life that they led. And you gave me that fascinating tour, and we talked about some of the social conditions. And you told me, for example, like the cost of staying in lodges and why these women were basically desperate to get off the street. But even in these hotels and lodges around the area. It was no Ritz hotel. And you told me the origin, for example, of the word hanging around. Could you just discuss that a little bit, and just like the different fees for the nightly lodgings and the origin of the word hanging around?
It's the word is hangover rather than hanging around. That's okay. So Whitechapel, the Whitechapel area, East End of London, was very destitute. It was a huge amount of poverty, and London had, been growing at a huge rate due to the Industrial Revolution. But by the 1880s, it was coming under strain from America doing better, Germany doing better. So its place in the world market was starting to decline, and certainly the rapid growth it had in the previous decades was declining. The East End of London was a hotbed for immigration. In the 1850s, 1860s, the Irish population had been escaping the Great Famine. And in the 1870s and early 1880s, the Jewish population was heading to Whitechapel, escaping the Russian pogroms. So there was a huge amount of poverty, a huge amount of poor people. Now, women had quite a specific problem. They were unlikely to have employment, and if they did have employment, it was very, very basic. It was mainly around sewing items or potentially selling posies of flowers and the like. They were normally kept by their husbands. So when their husbands left them, or they died, or they were separated, women fell into very, very hard times. And they invariably turned to prostitution, not necessarily professionally, not as their only source of income, but as a way of making money, making ends meet. So it was a very, very hard life for women back then. But you asked about the sleeping arrangements. So there was about 250,000 people living in Whitechapel at the time. Accommodation was very much at a premium, and there were about 15,000 people a night having to sleep on the streets. Now, there was obviously rooms there were houses that people could buy if they had the money. There were rooms that people could rent, but there were also doss houses. Now, doss houses were basically large rooms, dormitories, which were just crammed with beds. And for 4p each night, you could turn up, hand over your 4p, and you would get a bed for the night. Now, I remember the photos that I showed you, and people can check this online, literally looked like open coffins just lined up alongside each other. Looking back now, it's disgraceful, but at the time, it was at least some form of getting them off the street. Now, for 4p, you would get one of these open coffins, or in a slightly more upmarket doss house, you might get an actual bed. If you didn't have 4p, for 2p, you could sit on a bench and have a piece of string tied around you to hold you up. And if you didn't have 2p, if you only had a penny, you could go into a doss house. There would be a piece of rope tied from one side of the room to the other side of the room, and you would literally hang over this rope, over underneath your armpits, and that's how you would sleep for the night. Now, that would be an incredibly uncomfortable. You would probably wake up feeling as though you hadn't slept, and this term became associated with alcohol, which it is now. So when you've had a huge amount of alcohol, you wake up in the morning feeling, you've got a hangover, and you would probably feel as bad as the people felt when they were sleeping over the rope, hanging over the rope back in the 1880s.
Yes, that's fascinating. I just wanted to go through that because I want people just to understand how difficult the conditions were. And in a sense, it was society's fault to a degree that these women were really out there having to do this because there's really not other opportunities for them. So you have very difficult conditions in the society. You have women that really have very little option to bring in money if they're not married to a wealthy husband, and they're working women. And then you have this person that comes along, does these terrible things. As far as the main suspects, obviously there's endless amount of suspects that people have, but just to go through a few of them, one of them was a famous painter. It's Walter Sickert, I believe, right?
Walter Sickert, yes. He was a German artist. He was about 42 in 1888, and almost certainly not Jack the Ripper. But he gets associated with the case because he's got a huge fascination with Jack the Ripper.
Okay.
He paints women as though they've been murdered by Jack. So he has them lying on beds and lying on chaise lounge and lying in positions where looking as though their throats have been cut. And he's just got this complete fascination with him. And he claims that he moves into a room which was previously lodged in by Jack the Ripper. So his fascination just continues on throughout the story, but I don't think anybody really believes he is Jack.
Okay, just a few more. One of the famous ones is the Duke of Clarence. Could you just briefly discuss that?
So, absolutely. So I have to be very careful what I say here, but Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's grandson, the Duke of Clarence, as you rightly point out, he's always been associated with these murders because he was a well-known lover of prostitutes. And in fact, he catches an STD, he catches syphilis, which sends him insane and eventually kills him. Oh. And many people believe that he was Jack the Ripper getting revenge against the women who gave him the disease.
I see. Okay. But there's not much evidence for him, correct? I mean, besides just that.
There's not a lot of evidence for him, but if you remember my wrap-up, and again, I'm really not claiming that he is Jack the Ripper, but London keeps this story very, very quiet. And the Home Office have refused to release the Jack the Ripper papers with all of the evidence that the police collected. So you have to question perhaps why. Why would they hold on to all this information? Why wouldn't they release it into the public domain? And the only person who needs protecting in all of the Jack the Ripper story is Prince Albert.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So you can't, but it's a huge leap to say that they don't release the papers, so it must be him.
Okay.
I'm not suggesting that.
I just want to discuss two more. Aaron Kaczynski and then Francis Tumblety, the American. But as far as Aaron Kaczynski, he was a Polish barber in that area. I believe he was Jewish. And there was some papers recently, some news that supposedly his DNA was linked to a shawl that I guess was on one of the women. But then it was criticized, and they said, well, there was no evidence of the chain of evidence of where the shawl was, and there hasn't been a peer-reviewed DNA analysis. So could you just discuss Aaron Kaczynski and what you think about that?
Yeah, so Aaron Kaczynski, he's very interesting. The police absolutely believed that he was the suspect long before DNA evidence came. You know, that was 100 years later. At the time, they absolutely believed that Aaron Kaczynski was their man. They believed that whoever was carrying out the murders was going gradually insane. You can tell by if you look at the murders that have been carried out, they're getting progressively worse, progressively brutal, and they say whoever's doing it is going mad. Okay. And Aaron Kaczynski, after the last murder takes place, a while after, it's a good year, 18 months after the last murder, goes insane and gets committed to London Coney, which is was a big mental institution in North London. Now, the police quizzed him at great length. He lived another 20 years after being incarcerated, and at no point did he give any indication whatsoever that he knew anything about these murders. He never showed any signs of violence towards anybody. So it's very hard to pinpoint him. But as you rightly say, a shawl was found by the body of Catherine Eddowes, a silk shawl. And this was never washed, apparently. And in the 1990s, some DNA testing was done of it. And Aaron Kaczynski's DNA turned up on the shawl. So the police, were they vindicated 100 years after the murder, they believed it was him, and maybe the proof came to say, yes, it was him.
Okay. Is that the official police view now?
No.
No. Okay. So
no, the police don't have a view. Okay. Now they regard the case as closed. They're not going to reopen it. They say there's nothing can be gained from it. It's just going to continue to be a mystery, and it will be a mystery until they release all of the evidence that they have, which we're told is not going to happen.
it's kind of a little bit like the Kennedy assassination. They just recently released a lot of those files, and some of them are still being held, and that's, of course, 50 years ago, and this is over 100 years ago, so it's amazing.
Absolutely, it is, yeah.
And the final person is the most intriguing, I think, from our discussions, but Francis Tumblety. Could you just describe who that was, please?
So Francis Tumblety is an American. He's a doctor of herbology, so a bit of a quack doctor. A very wealthy man, and definitely a misogynist. He does not take kindly to women who work in prostitution. There's all sorts of stories about him. He was arrested for a lewd act in early November 1888. And many people rule him out of being Jack the Ripper because they believe when he was arrested, he was held in jail. But he wasn't. He was released on bail, and so therefore he was out and available to carry out the murders on every single night that a murder took place, including the last one, Mary Kelly, on the 9th of November. And once he was released, once he was out on bail, he did a runner. He ran to France, he ran to Boulogne, and then he got a boat from Boulogne back to America. Now, many people say that he used to hold dinner parties, and at his dinner parties he would show off his collection of medical curiosities, and one of these was a cabinet containing glass jars with women's uteruses in them, women's wombs. Now, some people say that perhaps Francis Tumblety was Jack the Ripper because he was murdering women on the streets of London to add to his collection.
Right. Now, I just want I know where you lead in this, and I don't, you can get as definitive as you would like in this program, but just to, in researching for this program, there's a person I'm sure you know Stuart Evans, who was a former London police person for 40 years, spent 40 years on this case, and he found something called the Littlefield letter, which, as I understand it, he was the head of the Special Branch Scotland Yard, and he mentioned Tumblety as a suspect at that time, and that letter was lost and just recently came out. So that was, to him, a very powerful evidence that it was Tumblety. He also said the murder stopped when Tumblety left London. As you did, he mentioned that thing about the police record, but he wasn't in jail when these occurred. And finally, and it's one of the most intriguing pieces of evidence, and you told me about it when I was on the tour. And could you please discuss the two rings that were allegedly found in his estate and versus linking it to one of the women, which is probably the strongest evidence?
Yeah, absolutely. This is the bit that I just cannot get round. I haven't found anybody who can justify or explain this. So Francis Tumblety was a very wealthy man. And when he died back in America, they did a full asset list of his estate. And he had, several $1,000s worth of bonds. He had some very expensive jewelry. But he also had two very cheap gold rings. These were valued at about somewhere between £1 and £2 each. So really, not very expensive. These two rings absolutely matched the descriptions of two rings that had been taken from Annie Chapman, who was victim number 2 of Jack the Ripper. So she was known for having these rings. All her friends identified her for these rings, so they must have had some sentimental value to her. Because even though they were only £1 or £2, that's money. So she would have been able to pawn them, she would have been able to sell them, but she didn't. She was known for having the rings. And when she died, the rings were missing. Her friends recognised that the rings were not on her, and these rings eventually end up in Francis Tumblety's estate in America. It's very odd, and I just can't see past him because of that.
And we know the rings ended up because was there an estate administration of his estate? That's how were they itemized, and we know that they're similar to this woman because of the description. Is that basically the link?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we don't know for certain that they're the same rings, but it's very unusual that he would have two very cheap rings, cheap gold rings, in amongst his his much more expensive jewelry, which is listed.
And also, Stuart Evans, the person I mentioned who found that letter from the head of Special Branch Scotland Yard linking Tumblety to these crimes, said that there was some allegation that he'd gone to Central America and did more of these killings, and that needed to be explored, and perhaps other crimes that have yet to be solved that he may have done too. So there was even some other intriguing things that he mentioned. But yeah, that's a pretty. And then there was another thing that he mentioned too, that maybe the police were embarrassed by having let him go, and that's one of the reasons why they never asked for an extradition. Do you remember anything about that?
Well, the police must have had their suspicions, because they did notify the New York police about Francis Tumblety when they realised he'd skipped bail and had headed back to America. So they did inform New York, and New York put an inspector following him or investigating him, which is very unusual. If he's an innocent man, why would you do that?
Right.
So yes, he wasn't innocent totally, because obviously he'd been arrested for lewd behaviour in the UK, but I'm not sure if that's a notifiable crime, lewd behaviour. So I think maybe the police did have their suspicions of just what a serious threat this Francis Tumblety was.
Yes, and he was, but he never, of course, answered for the crime, and he died, and the British never did ask for extradition. I don't believe. He was followed, as you said, and then they found these rings, and the files are still sealed. I mean, were any of the files released, or are most of them still sealed to this day?
No, they're all sealed. They're all sealed. They're all held in the apparently they're all held in the Black Museum, which is in Scotland Yard, which is only accessible by invitation only, and you have to be a member of the British Police Force to be able to get in. So it's not a museum that's open to the general public, and there's no real proper explanation as to why they won't release any of the stuff. But there is a lot of information in the public domain, because obviously it was covered by the newspapers, and we have the coroner's reports. Everything that was put into the public domain has been scanned and used by ripperologists over the decades to come up with their own versions of who Jack the Ripper was and what he actually did. But we know that the police have a lot more information.
Gosh,
and until we see that, we're just never going to really know.
That's very intriguing that 130 years later they would have all this still unreleased. Well, Phil O'Connor, and it's the Jack the Ripper Museum. It's jacktherippermuseum.org or .com? jacktherippermuseum.com. Phil O'Connor. I recommend everyone take the tour and take the tour with you. It was very informative and got me interested in doing this program. And thank you so much, Phil, for coming on today. I very much appreciate your time.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you, Ralph.
You.